don't hear anything. From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We will work with the UN Security Council for the necessary resolutions. But the purposes of the United States should not be doubted. The Security Council resolutions will be enforced. The just demands of peace and security will be met.
President Bush in 2002 asking the United Nations to support U.S. action against Iraq. Today we speak to the Chile ambassador to the UN about what actually happened behind the scenes, how the Bush administration pressured UN Security Council members to back the invasion, spied on its allies, and pressed for the recall of UN envoys that refused to back U.S. war plans. And then a new civil war is threatening to explode in Iraq as U.S.-backed Iraqi government forces fight Shia militiamen for control of Basra. We'll speak to Patrick Coburn. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Many Iraqi civilians are feared dead following a U.S. bombing of the town of Hilla. Witnesses have given conflicting accounts of between 11 to 60 casualties and scores more wounded. The Pentagon says U.S. helicopters were providing air support to Iraqi troops fighting Shia forces as part of the nationwide crackdown on Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army. The attack follows another U.S. strike that killed at least 5 civilians in the town of Tikrit. A relative of the victim said his family members had been burnt beyond recognition.
Those are 5 members from my family whom I should recognize. It was so hard for me to recognize them as the bodies were charred. This is the American democracy. This is the human rights that Bush has called for.
At least 3 homes were hit in the U.S. attack. Meanwhile, in Baghdad, residents are accusing U.S. forces of setting fire to a popular market in the sprawling Shia neighborhood of Sadr City. On Wednesday, hundreds of demonstrators took to the streets to protest the blaze and the ongoing U.S.-Iraqi fighting with the Mahdi army. Elsewhere in Baghdad, at least 1 civilian was killed and another 5 wounded when a mortar round hit a residential area.
What do we do? Where shall we go? We are staying here as a displaced family. We do not know where to go now. If we go back to the place where we were living before, we'll be killed. And here we have been attacked by mortar shells. Where shall we go? We have children, families. This is unacceptable.
And one of Iraq's main export pipelines, oil pipelines, was blown up on Wednesday in Basra. We'll have more on violence in Iraq later in the broadcast. The Washington Post is reporting the Bush administration is escalating unilateral military attacks against what it calls al-Qaeda targets in Pakistan. Amidst concerns, Pakistan's new government will try to limit future U.S. operations. The Pakistani president, General Pervez Musharraf, has been a staunch U.S. ally, but his powers will likely be reduced following his party's overwhelming loss in parliamentary elections last month. Pakistan's new leaders have suggested they're open to negotiation with militant groups. U.S. military aircraft have struck 3 targets over the past 2 months, killing around 45 foreign fighters near the Afghan border. But concerns have grown over the risk of civilian casualties. The news comes as 2 top U.S. envoys are drawing public outcry in Pakistan for a controversial visit. Deputy Secretary of State John Negroponte and Assistant Secretary of State Richard Boucher has been trying to convince Pakistani leaders to maintain Musharraf's key support for the so-called war on terror. The trip is seen as a sign of U.S. meddling before Pakistan's new cabinet has even been named. In environmental news, the head of the UN's climate change body is renewing calls for restrictions on carbon emissions to stave off global warming's effects on the polar ice caps. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change chair and Nobel laureate Rajendra Pachauri spoke after new images showed the collapse of a massive chunk of ice in the Antarctic.
There's enough evidence to show that there is accelerated melting of some of these large bodies of ice, West Antarctic ice sheet, the Greenland ice sheet. And as you know, we have, in our synthesis report of the IPCC, clearly mentioned the possibility of irreversible and abrupt changes, which could be essentially a collapse of some of these large bodies of ice that would result in several meters of increase in sea level.
The British Antarctic Survey says the area of the Wilkins ice shelf is about 7 times the size of Manhattan. It began breaking off in late February after being there for perhaps 1,500 years. Scientists say the rest of the Wilkins ice shelf is maintained only by narrow beams of thin ice and may collapse entirely. On the campaign trail, Republican candidate John McCain outlined his foreign policy platform Wednesday. Speaking in Los Angeles, McCain suggested he would reverse the Bush administration's isolation of the international community, but renewed his call for a so-called League of Democracies that some see as an attempt to sideline the United Nations. McCain also vowed to continue the U.S. occupation of Iraq, which he called a non-issue.
The question of Iraq is not presence, my friends, just like it's not a question of presence in Kuwait or Turkey or South Korea or Japan or Germany. The question is American casualties. That's what Americans care about.
In response, a spokesperson for Senator Barack Obama castigated McCain for seeking to continue, quote, an open-ended war. Senator Hillary Clinton was more conciliatory, saying, quote, while there is much to praise in Senator McCain's speech, he and I continue to have a fundamental disagreement on Iraq. In other campaign news, Senator Obama's former pastor has canceled scheduled appearances in Texas set for this weekend. The Reverend Jeremiah Wright has come under heavy criticism from political pundits for linking the attacks of September 11th to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and for saying the United States was founded on racism. In a statement, Reverend Wright cited safety concerns for his decision to cancel his appearances. Here in New York, dozens of protesters marched into the corporate headquarters of Bear Stearns Wednesday to call for federal assistance for homeowners and protest the investment bank's recent government-backed bailout. Earlier this month, the Federal Reserve put up $30 billion to help J.P. Morgan Chase purchase Bear Stearns. Meanwhile, homeowners are on the verge of foreclosure, and those who've already lost their homes have received little government support. Chanting, "Help Main Street, not Wall Street," demonstrators marched into the lobby of the Bear Stearns office building. Neighborhood Assistance Corporation of America head Bruce Mark said protests against investment banks would continue.
We've shown them that that's just the beginning. That's just the beginning. It's personal when someone loses their home. Yes. Someone has to live with that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Well, we're going to make the consequences of their actions personal to them. We will go to their country clubs. We will go into their neighborhoods. We will educate their children on what their parents do, because they should be ashamed.
The protesters are demanding a moratorium on foreclosures and that banks roll back interest rate increases. The former chief prosecutor at Guantanamo Bay has announced he's leaving the U.S. military. Colonel Morris Davis resigned from the Guantanamo military commissions in October, saying the system had become politicized and he could no longer be effective. In Israel and the occupied territories, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert has rejected calls to ease the stranglehold on the Gaza Strip and negotiate with Hamas. On Wednesday, Olmert said he's prepared to allow a limited number of humanitarian shipments, but nothing more. Israel's been accused of practicing collective punishment in Gaza. Meanwhile, Olmert also suggested a renewed military confrontation with Hamas could lie ahead.
Hamas is an obstacle. It is not an unsurmountable obstacle. It can be overcome. When and how is a different question. I don't think that I want to go into details here, but I said, and I want to repeat what I said before. We are not talking with Hamas, and we are not going to compromise with someone that is consistently shooting rockets on the heads of Israelis. We will deal with Hamas in other ways, and these ways will be very painful.
Israel's rejected Hamas offers for a ceasefire based on an Israeli withdrawal to its 1967 borders. And the Pentagon has suspended a $300 million contract with an arms supplier found to have been supplying decades-old ammunition to Afghanistan. AEY Incorporated has sent 40-year-old munitions to the Afghan government. It's also been accused of supplying gun cartridges bought in China, in apparent violation of U.S. laws. The military canceled the contract only after it received queries from the New York Times on AEY's activities. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
And welcome.